Stop listening to music like an amateur. This video will train your ears to listen to the precise impact of a compressor. Let's talk about the sonic illusion of loudness. This is a guitar track and we're going to see how a compressor is going to actually affect the loudness and the softer sections of this guitar. Not just audibly but even visually I'm going to show you the difference. The original track sounds like this. So there are some sections that seem loud and visually you can see that there are these transients that look way louder compared to majority of the other areas of this guitar. So we're going to use Pro Q3 for this compressor example because Pro Q3 is really good to visually see what's happening to that waveform. I have Pro Q3 here. I've kept threshold at this point and my ratio right now it's quite high, okay. So basically the role of a compressor is to reduce any loudest signals you have in your track, any peaks that you have in your tracks. So it's going to bring down the peaks while boosting the average volume level up. That's going to give you that illusion of perceiving everything as loud. When I keep my threshold, this dotted line indicates that any signal that goes beyond that line, the compressor will bring it down. Finally, we use this gain knob to overall bring the volume up. Okay, we don't want to lose the volume because of compressor. So when I play it now, you see those red lines that come down indicate that those are the signals that go above the threshold, therefore the compressor is pushing them down. And of course my ratio is quite high, but this is just a demonstration to show you how a compressor is actually working. Initially your makeup knob will probably be at 0, which means that's what it sounds like. So without the compressor, with so it has brought down anything that went above the threshold. So that's done. But you should understand that we add a plugin not to change the volume level before and after. In this case, my target is to reduce the peaks while raising the average level. I don't want a big dynamic difference between the loudest and the softest section of the track. So after I do compressor, I need to add an overall volume through the plugin. So I'll push this up and I'm going to keep an average value based on how much it's getting reduced. 2 dB. There's a very interesting thing that's happening. Without the compressor, by default that guitarist plays it by strumming and doing some finger picking styles, but without the compressor that finger picking area isn't quite heard well. Now with the compressor, it seems like that in between finger picking style is also heard well. Let me show you actually how it looks like after we take it as a bounce track, okay? So I'm going to solo this and I'm going to press Control B, which is going to bounce this track with the compressor. Let's rename this as acoustic guitar after compressor. And I'm going to leave the source as it is. Everything else is fine. I'm going to click OK. Now let's look at the waveform. So the waveform speaks a lot, doesn't it? So if you actually see, initially the original track has such a huge difference in the loudest and the softest section of the song. There's this huge difference. But after compression, softer and the louder sections more or less seem to be in the same space. That's what gives you the illusion that the softer parts have increased in volume, but rather you've brought the overall volume up while just bringing down the peaks. So this is after compression. We'll actually do a comparison between these two. So what you're hearing now is the original track. So what's happening is in the initial track, I cannot hear those finger picking music that loud, and I hear this difference in loudness that's not pleasant to hear. Whereas after compression, everything is more or less in the same level of volume. So I can hear the quieter sections in a much more nicer manner in the right level, whereas nothing is too loud also. This is the magic of compression. So this is how visually you see a difference, as well as audibly it actually enhances the track in the right dynamics. If you watched my videos and you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, I recommend you to subscribe to my channel to get more useful videos on music production and mixing mastering. Let's look at the sweet spot for attack and release. We have a kick as an example. Now I'm opening Pro C2 and we need to understand what attack and release does. Attack and release tells me how fast it's going to compress and how fast it's going to stop compressing. That's as simple as it is. So when the signal goes above that dotted line, above the threshold, that's when it's going to get compressed. But is it going to happen very soon or after some time? You can decide that, and that's what attack does. When the signal goes above the threshold, you can decide whether you want to compress it as soon as it goes above, or you let some signal go above. You just let it go that way and then you compress after that. You can decide that. Similarly, release is when you want it to stop compressing. Should it continue to compress for a while or should it immediately go back to the original level? That's what release does. The way you kind of design attack and release matters a lot, and in fact it kind of contributes to the quality of your entire mix in a way, because that can either make your track sound extremely compressed or extremely polished. When you take a kick drum as an example, the characteristic of a kick drum is that initial, transient, that sound you hear when the kick actually goes and hits, right? Like when you exactly play, that's these transients that you see here. Now, let me turn on the compressor and let's not worry about attack and release. Right now, this is my threshold. And we have a 2 dB reduction. But right now, specifically, we will focus only on attack. If I keep my attack extremely fast, let's listen to it. Without. With. We're going to do an experiment. We're going to bounce this with a very fast attack time. So once again, Control B. This is kick with fast attack. I'm going to do another bounce, but this time slow attack. Okay. Once again, Control B, kick with slow attack. Now, let's look at both these waveforms and analyze it a little bit. If you look at the fast attack kick, let's do a comparison. So we have this and okay, let's mute that. All right. So this is the slow attack kick. This is the fast attack kick. The slow attack. So what's happening is, when you keep a fast attack on the kick, the waveform tells you a lot. The initial transient is compressed, and in a slower attack, that initial transient is sort of retained to some extent and the rest is getting compressed. Now, how do you actually use it? We use kick majorly to kind of pump the song and keep the groove going, which majorly depends on that initial transient. Why would you want to compress that initial transient? That's going to make the kick sound dull. In fact, you will hear the compressed sound. That's what's happening with this fast attack. Whereas with this, it sounds more rounded and it feels like the kick has more body to it, more of like midst to it. Whereas on the other one, With fast attack, it just goes off quickly. So that's how important attack and release are. When I keep my attack fast, that's not going to work with a kick at all. So the best way to use a kick is to put your attack a little less so you retain the transient, you don't compress that. Now when you come to release, it's about the rest of the curve, right? You want it to continue compressing. So now if I keep my release too soon, look at the waveform. Goes down, comes up, goes down, comes up. But when I keep my release higher, do you see that? It gradually goes, isn't it? So let's look at the waveform also for this. So when I keep my release too soon, let's bounce it once again. Kick with fast. I'm going to put R. And I'm also going to do something else with a slower release. Okay, so this is going to be kick with slow. This is our slow release and this is our fast release. So we have slow release, fast. Okay, so what's happening is when you keep a faster release, just have a look at the end tail of the kick. It will look bigger because I'm not bringing down the rest of the kick, waveform. When my release is fast, I compress it and I go back to the original volume level very quickly. Hence, it's not touching any of the rest of the waveform. That's why the waveform remains the same. Whereas with the slow release, the other waveform seems to get compressed a little bit more for a longer duration. That's why the waveform looks smaller. How do you sculpt it? If you want a little bit more of the overall kick to just go down in volume and much more compact, put a slower release. Otherwise, you keep a faster release so that the rest is maintained like the original track. This really comes down to how you want the song to sound like or the genre of the song. For example, if I have like jazz as my genre, I normally won't do a lot of compression on it. I'll have a very subtle attack, very subtle release and hardly any compression, like 1 dB maybe. That's all I might do. That itself is a lot because jazz requires a lot of dynamics to it. Whereas if you take a pop song, you might do an aggressive compression to it and it'll sound good. So you should understand how attack release plays a role on the track in order to determine what settings you need for what kind of genre. Now let's get into the ratios perspective. Ratio is basically determining how aggressive you want the compressor to be. Ratio is usually like 4:1, 5:1. That basically tells us that when your ratio is set to 4:1, if 4 dB of signal goes above the threshold that you set, the result will only have 1 dB of signal, which means 3 dB of signal will get compressed. That's the meaning of ratio. And obviously you go to a higher ratio, 100:1, that's gonna like be more aggressive. And you want more gradual compression, then you go down like 2:1, 3:1, which is usually what I do for vocals and etc. When you want it more softer or aggressive, you control it majorly through ratio, okay? Now that you know how compressor works, doesn't mean you put it at an unreasonable level like this. I mean, you're losing a lot of signal because without the compressor and with half the signal is gone. See, it's 70 dB of compression and that's not what you want for your tracks. So be gentle with ratio. Just because you have it doesn't mean you need to push it that high, that extreme. Especially on like lead tracks, don't do it at this extent. Now, while we're on the same topic, continuing on that same thing that I talked about ratio is how much you're going to compress, and there's a slight difference between doing it subtle and doing it in a very clear manner, but working in the mix. I told you, yes, you're not going to put the ratio quite high, but then I'll show you methods where it's going to work, and that's when you sidechain it. I have a random kick track over here, and I'm just going to keep it there, okay? Just muted it. This is called a Saint. and I'm gonna use that to sidechain. Basically, I'm gonna compress the synthesizer whenever the kick is played. Okay, and it's not gonna compress all the time like what we did so far. It's gonna compress only when the kick is gonna come in. So on the right side, you'll have sidechain. Choose that, and since this is an audio track, I'm gonna go to audio, and there you go. This is my kick's name, so I'm gonna choose that. Then I'm going to select the sidechain in this plugin, choose this, and basically you've triggered it in a way where when the kick comes, synthesizer goes down. I'm going to remove auto gain. Let's keep the ratio very aggressive. In fact, I'm going to keep attack and release also quite aggressive. This was without the compressor. Now watch what happens. I mean, that's such an obvious way that there's a compressor, but then you're not really fixing any dynamic issues right now. You're creating a completely unique sound through compressor, and you're coupling that with sidechain to give this sound. So that's another magic that you can do with a compressor, and it's a common sound that you've heard on EDM tracks, trap music, house, all those kinds of heavy genres. You're going to hear these kinds of elements, and how does that happen? Through a compressor. And half of the time they won't even play that kick that they've linked it with. It'll work even when you muted it. All you need is just a kick that you need in a particular timing, and this is just going to work. This is an obvious compressor, like compression, where I've pushed everything to the maximum. But in this case, it works because I'm doing sound design rather than mixing it or like making things better. I'm developing a new design through compressor. Now comes the main question. How do you train your ears to make these professional settings and keep them right for your mix? That comes through ear training. And when I say ear training, there are multiple resources to do ear training. One is Sound Gym. When you go to the website Sound Gym, that's basically a website which is very useful if you are particularly a mix engineer, because you have so many auditory lessons for EQ, for compressor, for gain changes, for panning, and that's going to really benefit you a lot because you need to know these tiny changes that happens in the mix. When I showed you that attack with very fast and very slow settings, were you really able to hear it? Be honest. If you are not able to hear that difference, then your ears need to be trained to understand these nuances, because trust me, these are really big changes that happens in the mix. And if you think I'm not able to hear that much big of a change, so maybe that's not going to affect my mix, you're actually wrong, because those tiny things, when you compile them all together in the mix, that's what makes the mix, different from an amateur and a professional. Look out for websites like Sound Gym and keep your ears trained. Second, try these extreme settings on different tracks. We talked about kick, fast attack, slow attack. If you're not able to hear it on a kick, try it on a guitar, or try it on a synthesizer, or on a vocal. Experiment the same setting that you happen to keep on a kick on other tracks and see how it reacts to it. If it's difficult to understand, like what I did, bounce the track in place and visually try to find the difference between the original and the one with the compressor. You'll learn a lot through that. Sometimes, during mix, we often hear that we need to rely on our ears to do these changes, which is true. But in the beginning, it's also good to have visual cues. And this is a way by which you can actually develop that. So either practice through websites or do these visual cues, and over time, you'll be able to understand these differences. So if you have any other questions in whatever was taught today, comment that below and I'll definitely reply to your comments and answer your questions. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Florina Jain, otherwise known as Flow of Music, and I'll see you guys in another video.